and welcome to another episode of Spartalk. Today we're talking about the mass uprising shaking Iran for now a little over 2 weeks. This is the most substantial uprising since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which brought the current regime into power. The regime has responded to these protests with a massive crackdown. The country is under a digital blackout. No real news is able to get out. People can't get in touch with their loved ones. And although exact numbers are almost impossible to get as a result of this, hundreds, if not a ton more, are reported dead. Donald Trump, Israel, and Reza Pahlavi, the son of the former Shah, are all cheering on the protests, telling the masses that they will help them get freedom from the mullahs. Trump has threatened direct military action, telling Iranians that help is on its way, and the regime in turn has threatened retaliation towards the imperialists. Within all this, the task for revolutionaries must be to guide the struggle of the Iranian masses towards a successful outcome, one which is directed against both the Islamic regime and the imperialists who smell blood. So, to discuss the situation in Iran, I'm joined by Comrade Vincent. Hello.
Hello, Mansa.
How are you?
Not too bad. How are you?
Oh, all right, I guess. So look, before I field you a question, I want to, this is a very charged discussion right now on the left, on social media, etc. So I just want to note a couple of things right at the start of our discussion. The struggle of the Iranian masses is legitimate. The regime must be overthrown, and we are with the masses to fight for that aim. At the same time, we do not deny that all kinds of pro-imperialist and Zionist elements are at work, trying to use these protests to advance the aims of the US and Israel within the country and in the region more broadly. But it's precisely because of this that we insist that it matters which force brings down the regime and what comes next, that this is actually decisive. And this is a discussion that I think is not actually being had. Now, we stand with the movement and we call on the left in Iran and internationally to fight for a working class and an anti-imperialist program to bring down the government and install a workers' government in power. This is what we fight for, and we laid all this out in a very short statement that we put out a couple of days ago called Iran, the Revolution Must Be Anti-Imperialist. Now, I want to discuss some responses to that general perspective, but later on in the discussion. But first, I want to ask you to explain, I think, the broad outlines of our intervention and what it's trying to do.
Right. So I think you've summarized quite well some of the points, and the way we've tried to intervene from afar, obviously, is kind of hitting at the broad two trends we see in reaction to this movement, to this uprising. And it's a bit of a complicated situation on the political level, because on the one hand, you have a trends which support the protest, almost sometimes uncritically, just cheering on the eruption of the masses, the uprising of the masses, but which either openly supports imperialist forces, Israel, the United States, or at least does not criticize them or does not make opposition to Israel or the United States a priority or an important task of the revolution. And for us, that's a grave mistake, a betrayal, really, to support the exploiters of the entire region. And then there's another trend that we see often more tied to the pro-Palestinian movement, who has denounced the demonstrations outright as like a Zionist conspiracy, and really sort of using the real pro-imperialist element in those demonstrations. There are Mossad agents on the ground. There are, obviously, as you said, Trump is openly backing the protest and using these to discredit the entire movement, and essentially ends up defending either implicitly or explicitly sometime the regime of the Islamic Republic. Mm-hmm. And for us, these are two false avenues, and often the left falls into one of those two poles or is sometime in the middle. And for us, a communist pole in those protests must be built sort of against these two trends, firmly on the anti-imperialist side, against the US, against Israel, but certainly also against the Islamic Republic.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I think my reading of the situation, and as you said, look, we're far from the situation. Neither one of us is experts on Iran, but we do know a thing or two. But more importantly, I think this is really broadly the problems that the left is having on Iran is really a reflection of the more general historic problems of the left when it comes to dealing with, revolutionary movements within oppressed third world countries. Okay, I think I'll just say that, because it's an inability to deal with forces that are able to posture as anti-imperialist.
Exactly, yeah.
But that are not actually based on or not working class forces, right? So, for example, the regime. Now, in the leaflet that we published, how I see that intervention is from my survey of the left generally internationally, but also a lot of like on social media, like what progressive Iranians and other groups are saying. The whole question of the fight against imperialism doesn't really play a prominent, if any role, to be honest, to be very frank, you know. And the Western left, you'll have like mentions of like no foreign intervention, et cetera, but it's not made the cornerstone of that strategy. And I want to start by talking about why. Like, why do we say that the revolution must be anti-imperialist?
Well, first of all, let's just start with the illusions. Like why, like you mentioned, it doesn't play a role. I think even more, I think there's a lot of illusions in some segments of either those who are protesting in Iran, certainly in the diaspora, illusions in imperialism in the United States, in Israel even. So maybe we can just a bit discuss why there are those illusions. I think an important element, you mentioned the economic situation. Look, there's two things to distinguish, I think. First, partially in the diaspora, you have these hardcore monarchist, pro-Israeli, pro-US, and these are always a constant. Every time there's something going on in Iran, they come out against the regime. Now, it's hard to know what sort of support they have in Iran, but it seems from many people it's quite small. However, I think it's impossible to deny that in those protests, there are large illusions in the United States, not in the sense of like they love the monarchy, but look at the economic situation in Iran. It's like food inflation is over 70%. Shelves have been emptied. The currency is like in free fall. And there is an attitude, which I don't know how widespread it is, but I assume in the various contexts or things I've heard is quite widespread, that a sort of accommodation with the US, a deal with the US would be a lesser evil. That we should stop the path of confrontation with the US, get sanction relief so that we can get the economy going a bit better. And that for that, we should probably just give in to some of the US demands. That's probably some of the most common illusions in US imperialism that you see. Or I think you also get people who are like, well, anything but that regime, honestly, at this point. It's not like I like the monarchy. It's not like I want Israel or the US, but like this is an oppressive tyranny. And let's have like, I don't know, some form of democracy or anything but the mullah. I think that's also probably a widespread sentiment.
But again, I think going back to what I was saying at the introduction, it really matters what's going to replace the regime. And I think that's a really difficult thing for people to hear. People who are really right now invested in these protests. And yes, we are too, but it's really crucial what's going to replace it. And for me, that brings me to one of the points we make in our statement, but also one of the things that I think is generally agreed upon amongst like bourgeois analysts and, you know, Iran followers and whatever, which is who's the real opposition to the mullahs? Like within the country, they've, you know, not allowed a real opposition, of course, but generally, and again, and you see this trend, anytime there's a movement within Iran, the only real face of the opposition that emerges is Reza Pahlavi, you know, and he always tries to use it as an opportunity to like, you know, find a way back into power. And that's, again, I totally agree with you. I don't think the Shah's son has any real base within the country, but unfortunately, he is the real face of that opposition.
It's like the sort of the only coherent pole in a certain sense. Yeah. But let's get into the argument as to why people shouldn't be looking towards the US or Israel or to sanction relief, for example. Wouldn't that be good to have sanction relief? You know, why is it not like a good idea? If we take the argument head on. Why should they be anti-imperialist? The argument is quite simple, so let's get into it. The US and Israel, they want to overthrow the Islamic regime because it remains the sort of only obstacle in their, or not only, but main obstacle in their domination over the Middle East. And they want to do in Iran what they've did everywhere else in the region where they was also a regime who were hostile to their interests. Look at Iraq, look at Syria, look at Afghanistan, look at Libya as well in North Africa. Every time they intervene, it is to sow chaos and destroy a society so that it can get out of the way of their projects. And that's really important to understand this because, of course, they mask their intervention with all sort of great values about democracy, about saving the people, et cetera. But it is always, of course, I think their best case scenario would be a monarchy, the monarchy to come back, sell out the country, mass privatization, and for Iran to become a semi-colony of the US. I think that would be their best case scenario. However, they have no qualm to transform Iran into a totally chaotic and war-torn region like they've did elsewhere. That would be, they could still live with that. So, and just on the point on sanction relief, the United States has tremendous sanction on Iran, which are already choking the economy. Mm-hmm. They will give sanction relief at a heavy, heavy price. They will ask probably for the entire nuclear energy apparatus to be dismantled. They will ask for concessions for American companies. They will ask control over certain levers of the economy. And it will be the first step toward the transformation of Iran into a U.S. semi-colony. And that's really the problem when you were talking about the options on offer, the Shah being the only coherent opposition, or what are the other alternative outside of a communist pull? It's really all the movement pushes towards an accommodation to U.S. imperialism, and that must really be resisted. We cannot stress that enough. And I think it's really easy to get blinded to that. You see the people on the street, you see the anger, you want to get the regime thrown, but you've stressed that a few times already. You have to keep that in mind. They will turn the country into a pile of ruin, essentially.
Yeah. One thing I think what you've said is correct. I think people following the protests and supporting the protests will listen to us and say, oh my God, we hate you. Why? Because this is precisely what the regime has used for so long to keep its foot on the masses, right? To really and choke the masses by saying, look, we're going to defend the country. And, if you don't agree with us, you're really traitors to the country. So there's this real revulsion against some very basic commonsensical arguments you've made, but there's a real revulsion, not maybe to the arguments, but to the whole notion of like anti-imperialism.
Yeah.
Because the regime has done such a good job of associating itself, of taking on that mantle.
Yeah.
And especially in the recent...
The Ayatollah says similar things to what I just said, how the US wants to turn Iran into a new Iraq. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's probably in part why we don't see anti-imperialism being so prominent in discussions amongst the sort of leftist, progressive Iranian milieus, because they hate it, because they think it's the Ayatollah's ideology. And I want to, I think, separate these things out, because this really is one of the ways in which the left is not able to deal with, quote, anti-imperialist regimes. Like, what is that? Honestly, let's just break it down in just basic words. It just means that this regime has been saying to the US, look, we're not going to get on our knees so easy. That is anti-imperialist. They're just not capitulating right away. They're not rolling over anytime the US says something. They've been defying that. That is anti-imperialist. But what we mean by that is not just that, And I think I don't want to get into a whole semantic debate about it, but there is a real point about it's their anti-imperialism versus a real Marxist-Leninist anti-imperialism. And I think we have to be able to really fight to get people to understand what we mean by that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, we can get into the anti-imperialism of the regime in the next, when we talk about those who support it. I think for me, the main point to understand for those who want to topple that regime is that a lot of the legitimacy of the regime and whatever support it has in the population comes from the fact that it claims to defend the nation. It claims to defend the country against U.S. imperialism and Israel, and even went to war with it. That's how it maintains a base of support, because Iran is an oppressed country. You have to start with this. Iran is choked by imperialism, encircled by imperialism, has been attacked by imperialism, and the regime pretends to be the sort of only barrier in the face of such aggression. And actually, the fact that the movement against the Islamic Republic have been dominated for many years now by the Shah, or by even pro-imperialist liberals or pro-democracy people tied to NGO or the US, has really discredited a lot of these movement in the broader Iranian population, who, even those segments who might not like the regime, but who fear more an overthrow of the regime and the opening of the country to Israel and the US than they and they fear the regime itself. So
Mhm.
that's key to keep in mind. If you need anti-imperialism to actually unite the population of Iran, you need an opposition to the US and Israel. And actually, it's only on this terrain that you can really compete with the regime, actually, in a certain sense, for the support of the population.
Yeah, you have to take them on their terrain and show how their strategy to defend the country against imperialist aggression is actually totally bankrupt, you know? And we'll come to the question of uniting like people, not just like within Iran. I mean, Iran, just for anybody who listened and balked, yes, Iran is oppressed itself, but it, of course, itself is a prison house of peoples, oppresses the Kurds, the Baloch, Azeris, et cetera, et cetera. And to really, again, fight to liberate those nations as well as the country, you need to, again, center the whole struggle against imperialism. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to talk about was why you really do need to make opposition to the US and Zionism like a key part of your strategy. It's not enough to just say, we don't want foreign intervention, we just want our little thing. Because look, those might be nice wishes. This is just not how politics works. There's no vacuum in politics. So right now, the only real way to kick out the regime without like giving an inch to the liberals who are just going to tie you to, the right wing that are going to tie you to the imperialists, the only way to do that is to really draw a clear line that will not compromise, on key questions of working class interests. So the basic point we're trying to make is that to fight the regime and to successfully get it out, it needs to be based on an anti-imperialist strategy.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, speaking of the anti-imperialist people, I mean, it's been actually really tragic to see that so much of the pro-Palestinian movement, like, the Axis of Resistance people, they've been totally denouncing these protests as this is just CIA Mossad-backed propaganda and it's totally reactionary and you are just basically helping the imperialists if you support these protests. And I've had a number of arguments online with people of this nature who are like, your position is basically reactionary because you are helping the U.S. fulfill its aims regarding Iran, right? And I think that that's actually a really craven position.
Well, this position comes from the people who defend that. They want to oppose U.S. imperialism. They want to oppose Israel. They want to liberate Palestine. And obviously, the Islamic Republic has given arm to the Palestinian resistance, has exchanged fire with Israel and the U.S. It's been really one of the pole in the region that could counter the genocide, really. And they see, therefore, any protest against this as a threat, particularly protest, which the imperialists are trying to use as a complete threat. But so starting from a correct impulse of wanting to fight imperialism, they end up defending the Islamic Republic itself. That, I think, is where the mistake lies.
The capitulation.
Yeah, the capitulation lies indeed. Yeah. I mean, just for a starting point, like, yes, there's been like Mossad agent in these demos, provocateurs, etc., etc. This is all true, but it's completely false that these protests are just fabricated by Israel and the imperialists. Like, millions of people in Iran hate the Islamic regime.
Exactly. I mean, just putting Iran to the side for just 1 second. I mean, groups like this, maybe not so much the pro-Palestinian milieu, but really this trend on the left, it's like this sort of more Stalinoid, third worldist trend in the left. Last year when a number of these Gen Z revolutions happened, they denounced them as well. In Nepal, I know there was a huge current saying, oh, these are just color revolutions. Why? Because it's against the Communist Party. Yeah, in Indonesia as well. And it's like, again, imperialists will always try and take advantage of mass upsurges. They always will, But what does that mean for the responsibility of Marxists? Should we just be like, oh, are there imperialists in this? Yes or no? Okay, well, there are maybe 1 or 2, maybe 20, maybe 200. Okay, there are. Oops, it's tainted. Let's just sit back to the side and denounce this. Because, it's like, that's not like... Hundreds of thousands and millions of people do not just come out because they're all of a sudden bought off by, the lies of the imperialists.
Yeah. It's really not understanding the dynamics of social movements and class struggles.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, people have been really angry at this regime for some time now. Yeah. Anyways, okay. So come back to Iran. Like, it's to really not understand the deep hatred for the regime. I think that's one. I think second, it's to also put faith in the Iranian regime for the liberation of Palestinians. It's like, well, yeah, okay. The axis of resistance is the only force that materially, backed the resistance and so on. Fine. But that's not a road that revolutionaries propose to fight for the liberation of Palestinians. There's always a class independent road, to fight for national liberation. And I think that's also their other mistake of putting their actual political faith in the regime.
I think there's these two problems. So the regime is massively hated in Iran. If we talk about the condition of women with the imposition of the veil, if we talk about the condition of national minorities like Kurds and Baloch people, where they struggle, their language is denied, their national rights are denied. If we talk about the exploitation of the working class as well, the ruling clique is extremely corrupt, extremely parasitical, racks up massive profits from the black market and all sorts of schemes, while the masses honestly live in dire poverty, in many places, particularly lately. And then the regime says that they are the anti-imperialist fighters, and if you oppose us, you are pro-imperialist. Well, a lot of people actually, that's why they turn their back to anti-imperialism in many ways. So associating anti-imperialism with the regime actually gives anti-imperialism a bad name. One of the examples, for example, a lot of people are complaining about the Islamic Republic sends a lot of money to Hezbollah, for example, or to Hamas. And a lot of people say, oh, why do you send all this money while we live in dire poverty here? Now, the problem with the regime is not per se to fund the resistance. We're not against that. But they have told the masses to accept terrible conditions without a clear end in sight and without a clear program to succeed, and seeing all the corruption. All of this really disgusts a lot of people and really don't see the point of this, honestly. And if I can make a second point, which is really, I think, the key point against those who opposed all the demonstration and block in the name of anti-imperialism, is that the strategy of the Islamic Republic against Israel and the US has really been a failure. Actually, that's what's at the heart of the crisis right now. And I think that's important for pro-Palestinian militants to realize this. I don't know if you want to get into this, jump onto this, but I think that's a point.
I think it's worth going into it because, look, we've made this point in previous articles and when we've been writing on Palestine and Iran, but when you're talking about the Middle East, you're really talking about a region that's been so carved up by imperialism that any movement for one country is necessarily going to be linked to trying to mobilize people in the whole region. Yes, right now this is a struggle of the Iranians, but for it to be successful and last and go towards a progressive direction, it also needs to spread to the region, because Israel's still there. And now you have, Saudi and the UAE and all their sort of machinations that the imperialists are trying to do and all of that stuff. So it's really a broader question of how to unite this really divided people. You got divisions along national lines, like countries that have gone to war with one another. You got the Sunnis and the Shias. You've got all kinds of divisions. And I do think it's worth taking on why placing your faith in the axis of resistance as a way to defend the Palestinian people is really a bankrupt strategy.
Iran's strategy for many, many years actually has been to try to build up these proxies, or whatever you want to call them, these forces that are much closer to Israel, like Hezbollah, like Hamas, like the Houthis in Yemen, forging alliance with the Assad regime, and really trying to build this sort of network. Some call them for defense. The logic behind strategic patience as a doctrine was we're gonna slowly increase the pressure on Israel, slowly increase the pressure on the US, make their current stance or the US presence in the Middle East more and more costly, slowly and gradually. Together also with multipolarity and international law, and at some point the US is just gonna leave, and at some point Israel is just gonna want a deal. And that was sort of the logic. But then after October 7, what happened is that Israel just went on a rampage, went on a genocidal offensive, obviously, in Gaza, and then knocked out one after the other the pillars of the axis of resistance. And Iran kept, rather than going on the offensive and responding to this challenge, really kept to this strategic patience and got more and more isolated. Hezbollah was completely decapitated. The Assad regime fell, which, by the way, the Assad regime is completely hated as well by his people. Iran supported it. This fell. Hamas obviously hasn't fallen, but has been, seriously weakened, let's say. And this all the way to the war was brought to Iran, which really showed that was the whole point of strategic patience, was to avoid a confrontation with Israel and the US. But Israel and the US brought the war to Iran. So it has really been and if we look at the Palestine struggle, it's been set back a lot in Palestine itself. So those who want to fight imperialism and fight for Palestine must come to terms with the strategy of the axis of resistance has not worked, because it was not based on mobilizing the masses, seeking to unite all these various peoples that you mentioned, across ethnic, national, religious lines. It was based on these network, often on Shia sectarianism rather than class interest. It was based on supporting, sometimes propping up these hated regime like the Assad regime, and that's really the problem. It has shown its failure against an enemy which was just determined to give blow after blow. I like to compare the two. The one of the slogan of the strategic patient is "Boil the Israeli frog slowly." And slowly increase the pressure. And one of the slogan of the Israeli Secret Service is "Rise and kill first." And I like to explain the 2-3 years we've seen as like they rose and killed first and went for the kill, went for the jugular, and Iran really was on the defensive and sort of in a passive stance, and that really was very costly. And in many ways, the crisis economically even that we see today in Iran is a result of the failure of that strategy to confront the imperialists.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, what happened following the war was that the regime itself was weakened domestically. So not only did this whole strategy did not put an end to the genocide, I think the biggest proof that the strategy didn't work is to look at the state of Gaza, right? Look at the number of people murdered. But second, that this actually undermined their own political strength domestically, weakened them, and actually set them up for all this. So there you go.
Actually,
go on.
Just quickly, the greatest criticism that communists and revolutionaries should make of the Islamic Republic is precisely this. Their strategy and political program could not defend the country against U.S. imperialism. That's actually the greatest problem. Sorry.
But why are we insisting on this when events are happening on the ground and there's real turmoil happening right now and people want to rise up against the regime? Why are we taking the time to explain the failure of the axis of resistance and of putting your faith in this sort of anti-imperialism? It's because really to step back and look at the big picture. Like, how are we going to take this current movement forward in a progressive direction, right? You need to win over those elements. And how you're going to do that is by actually explaining to them why their interests for the Middle East and for Palestine especially lies in liberating Iran from the rule of the mullahs and installing a real anti-imperialist and working class government in power. That's actually going to be one thing that's really going to maybe give Israel the real pause that it needs, like installing a different force in power. So why we're trying to make these arguments, and I'll come to this in a second. I think people might think that we're kind of like crazy and saying all these things that are not really achievable. I'll get to that in a second. But honestly, you have to look like, what are the different choices on offer, right? You've got a hated regime, you don't have a coherent left-wing opposition, and you've got imperialists smelling blood. So there's a real need to unite the progressive forces who right now are caught in all kinds of traps and are actually in real time capitulating to the hated mullahs, but also by refusing to fight the mullahs, they're also capitulating to imperialism. And that's a real betrayal right now of the struggle to really take the Middle East forward in an anti-imperialist direction.
Yeah. It comes back to the point that the only way you can go against the mullah is really by offering a different strategy to combat imperialism. It's really how you will be able to win over their base elements in the military. It isn't with, liberal stuff and Western democracy that will actually push most of the population closer to the regime. As if there's a communist pole that can really, here's a strategy that can really defend the country and more broadly liberate the region from the US.
On this point, I want to pick up on this thing that's been controversial on social media. And again, it's really made a lot of the pro-Palestine movement put a lot of wind in their sails, saying look, we told you these protests are reactionary. Because what's happened, there's been reels of protesters burning mosques.
Gosh.
And that has really inflamed a lot of this sort of polarization where people are like, look, see, if this was a real progressive thing, they wouldn't be burning mosques. Come on. Of course, it's the CIA agents. And then the response I've seen is a number of Iranian leftists and progressives and anarchists actually explaining, well, no, we burnt down the mosques and this is a good thing because the mosques are a symbol of oppressive power, because this is an Islamic regime. It's a fascistic theocracy. So the mosque is not a really just purely a religious thing. It's like a site of domination and power and oppression. So really by burning the mosque, we're really fighting the regime. So again, you have this totally toxic polarization. And I wonder if you wanted to lay out our opinion on this, because we do have an opinion.
Yeah. Well, it's just the best way to make sure you're not going to win the mass of the population against the regime. It's of course the sentiment against the Islamic theocracy, against religion, is a progressive one. We do not it's good. Women who want to get their veil off and who want to reject religious state imposition, that is actually progressive. However, really push that sentiment forward, you need to topple that regime. And for that, you need to win over the mass of working people who are religious. So don't burn mosques if you want to win them over. It's a very anarcho-eyed sort of radical atheist strategy, which ends up only infuriating or stepping on sensibilities rather than seeking to win over those people. As I said, if you want to speak to the masses of Iran, you really have to tap into the anti-imperialist sentiment that the regime uses. Turn it against them. That's really the key. Yeah.
I think that kind of sums it up. There are, when you're doing your sort of reading and you're talking to people, there is this feeling of people have kind of as a expression of their opposition to the regime. There is this growing movement against Islam as well, where people are I'm not down with this. If this is what an Islamic regime is, I don't want anything to do with Islam, right? So you see that because the regime conflates politics and religion so well, right? It is a theocracy. So it does end up putting people off from Islam as well. But then again, I think, you have to be really politically conscious of this thing. Right? As you've been saying, you have to win over the people who probably are still very, very religious. And it's just a way to trample on their sensibilities. But again, also look at the region. This is just giving a free pass to, all the enemies of the Shias being oh, look, see, they're counter-revolutionaries, and it's not helping to build a unity between other peoples who live in different countries, and all they don't see your hatred for the regime when you burn down the mosque. They see, oh, you're burning down my religious institution, right? So it's just really adventurous stuff. And I think these kinds of acts actually help to undermine the movement, because these are the kinds of things that are really going to be very quickly latched onto to discredit the movement. So it's not smart. It's not clever. Now, we've had some feedback to what we've been saying with this leaflet, that Iran, the revolution must be anti-imperialist. And I just want to pick up on a couple of things. The first one, this sort of trend, I've had some arguments along these lines online, but, you've had some other feedback as well saying, look, this is nice, but it's not realistic. This is never going to happen. Yeah. And there's people who, formally will be okay, I see what you mean. This is good stuff. I'm with you in spirit, but not going to happen. Why? Because either the forces are not there, or because the Iranian people have somehow, just lost all faith in these things, or whatever, whatever the argument is. And I want to address those arguments, because it really goes towards defeatism, and that's no good.
Yeah, that's a lot of the feedback I've got as well. It's well, I agree, but it's not going to happen. You're not going to have
crazy. Some guy,
anti-imperialist poll.
Some guy on X said, "What are you going for? Good vibes? Who are the workers? Where's the left? What are you just going off of? Good vibes?" And I'm well, I don't think it's just good vibes, But it's really a question of your political approach and your method. You're you sit back, and you're oh, okay, I don't see the left, I don't see the workers anywhere. So you know what? We can't really put this forward. And well.
Iran used to have a huge communist movement, actually, and it was crushed by the Islamic regime. And ironically, while a lot of the left today tends on the to be on the pro-imperialist side, back then they were all capitulating in various ways to the mullahs, to Khomeini, and in the name of anti-imperialism. A lot of leftists supported this regime until this regime put them in prison and massacred them by the thousands, actually. So there used to be a communist movement in Iran. There is a communist tradition. Now, we don't have a group in Iran. If there are Iranians listening to this, please get in touch. We really want to talk to
even
you.
if you hate it.
Yeah, even if you hate it, we can have a discussion. But as communists, you have a responsibility, even if it's difficult, to at least say, here's what needs to be done.
Yeah.
We're never, at least in the ICL, we're never going to, because there isn't an apparent communist movement, we're not just going to, give up, too bad, and let just either the monarchists or the liberals win, or just the regime crack down and go on. How do you build a communist pole in Iran right now if it isn't by starting with small networks and individual contacts, which can eventually form an underground network, just like the Iskra did in Tsarist Russia? That's sort of a perspective at the moment. So I think it's true that we're not like naive, we're not idiots. We know that we have a lot to, there's a lot to be done. There's not a communist pole right now, as we talked about. But, you got to start building it.
Yeah. Because for me, it's like right now, the situation is such that there's really no other answer, right? There's no halfway house right now. This is the only real road forward. Now, just because it's not possible right now doesn't mean you don't put it up and say, hey, this is what's necessary, and you fight for it, because you have a huge uprising. It's going against the regime that's been in power for decades. The imperialists are waiting, for their chance. Anything, I don't know what the analysts are saying as their most recent thing, but my reading of the situation is that the regime is probably going to fall, but who's going to replace it? What are the options out there? Maybe some reformist elements from the regime. I don't know. But some people say that, that won't really be tolerated because the masses are so pissed off by just any kind of religious, force, any kind of force that is on a continuity with the regime. I don't know.
I'm not so sure,
Yeah, any kind of reformist force that comes in, it's only going to be allowed in and allowed to stay and exist because it will have made a concession to the imperialists.
Yeah.
Then I think on the other end, it's all really a continuity. Okay, say you have some pro-democracy government come in. Is that a good thing? No, because that's what the imperialists want. It will be opening the door to a slow reinstallation of a pro-monarchical setup. So that's not an answer either. So honestly, this might sound crazy, but as we see it, the only choices right now are between a workers' government or reaction.
Well, the maintenance of the regime through massive repression, or a pro-US regime, which will have to massively repress. Those who dream of liberal democracy in Iran, I think, can keep dreaming, because, the choices are, workers' government, or the regime stays, or a pro-US regime, which will have to use massive repression, obviously.
Yeah.
And that's excluding also civil war and chaos, which is also a possible avenue.
Yeah. And the situation of the left internationally is so bad, but real life and real events don't wait for the left to be ready to unfold. It's our problem. It's the fault of the international left that it's in such a discredited and weak situation. That we are not a force that's able to intervene and actually point a way forward. Not just we, but the left as a whole. So when events unfold and the choices are posed, it is what it is, right? And just because the left doesn't exist as a force that's actually able to fight for power doesn't mean you don't call the question and say what should be done, right? And that's where we're coming from when we put this position forward.
Yeah.
Because
I
there's
think,
no halfway house.
If I can make another point just regarding historically the left after the Islamic Revolution, is the reason we built our statement this way, and we've talked about this, is that the creation of a communist pole really requires solving this conundrum we've been talking about for 50 minutes of you have a regime that claims to be anti-imperialist. You have an opposition which is tied to imperialism, to liberals, to monarchists, etc. But you have people who hate that regime, and it's sort of solving how can you get rid of that oppressive regime while opposing the imperialists. And it's really when solving this debate, this conundrum is really key, I think, for the left. And the problem, I think, I'm no specialist on the Iranian left, but the problem I've been seeing in my time in the communist movement regarding Iranian communists, they're always, yes, they'll say against imperialism, but they're always very close to liberals, to people who are themselves pro-imperialist. The unity of progressive forces against the mullahs, or openly silent sometimes. Even some left groups were careful in their support to Palestine during the genocide because they don't want to alienate their liberal and Zionist backers. That's really a disastrous course. The only way forward you'll be able to win the confidence of the Iranian people is on the terrain of anti-imperialism. And that's, I've said it already like 10 times, but that's so key. And it's solving that conundrum. I think that's really important.
Now, I just want to make clear, like, this is a problem of the Iranian left. But, within this, like, sort of toxic polarization, this, like, flip-flop, what's really drowned is a real living struggle of the masses. This is why, again, I'll insist, and I know this is not nice to hear when there's like crazy events unfolding on the ground, but our contribution was really to try and like answer those two flip-flops, why either side is no good, and to provide counter arguments to both in order to motivate a third pole, which we put forward, a number of sort of programmatic demands for. Because unless you resolve this, like this trap that the left is in, what is going to be drowned, and we're seeing this happen real time right now, where Trump, even Farage, I think yesterday was out at a Iranian protest saying we want freedom for Iran. What's really happening is that the imperialists are latching on to the complete impotence and failure of the left to deal with this, that it's actually choking. It's actually putting the struggle of the Iranian masses for their livelihood, for their liberation, into a tighter and tighter chokehold. So this is why we don't do this to lecture or to be pedagogical, but we're really doing it because this is the trap that you see time and time again. Drown revolutionary upsurges in the third world. So I want our listeners who are listening and who think like you guys are like focusing on the wrong things right here, but to really like understand the bigger picture within which you can actually fight to cohere like a real communist alternative that's able to resolve these contradictions. I've kind of already touched on this. The other kind of trend in the feedback we've received is that this is cynical. There's a real revolution happening right now, and here you are kind of like issuing warnings and stuff, and this is just a bit pessimistic. And on one hand, I can see that there's like frustration, like, oh my God, there's things happening right now, and like, you got to do something and whatever. But on the other hand, like, I feel like, my answer, I don't know about you, but my answer is like, you can't just make up for like decades of weakness and betrayal. Like the left just isn't a force. So what are we supposed to do? Can't make up for it.
I also think you cannot underestimate the threat, Yes, the masses on the street. Yes, the masses are angry. They're right to be angry. But you can't underestimate the powerful forces that are in action right now to make sure that this uprising ends up in a U.S. colony.
Yeah.
You can't. And it's not about what's in people's heart or whatever, they're, as I said, they're legitimate. It's about the capacity of political forces to channel things. And that's why we want to channel it in a communist, anti-imperialist, working class direction. But there are powerful enemies who are seeking to channel this into pro-US regime change, civil war, destruction of the fabric of society like they did elsewhere.
Yeah.
You cannot underestimate that. It's a real threat.
Yeah. No, you're right. And I think I want to bring in some, like, I guess, lessons from the Marxist movement, from the Russian Revolution. Because what's really needed, I think, underlying our discussion and our intervention generally is what we're insisting on is that there is a need to fight for a third pole on which to split that movement, to drive out the conciliators of liberalism. And you need to do that on a basis that's anti-imperialist and working class. But the key thing is to fight for a political split within this movement, not just some undifferentiated mass that's, righteously rising up against the regime. All these political actors have their own different agendas, and communists, Marxists need to fight for their program to be at the head of this. That's going to and split the movement on those lines. And this is what I think the left is not seeing. And that goes across the board. Mm-hmm. Nobody talks about the need for a split. They see an uprising, they're like, oh, go, okay, great.
It's usually unity, and depends unity with who. Exactly. You know what I mean? Yeah. We need unity of the working masses of Iran, not unity with pro-imperialist liberals.
Yeah. Yeah. So the question of the split is one, but I think the other thing that I've been thinking about a lot when it comes to the recent weeks of protests in Iran is really the February Revolution.
Mm.
In the history of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky has this beautiful chapter, The Paradox of February. And it's making me think of that a lot because you've got this huge uprising that might God knows, maybe I've got this all wrong or we've got this all wrong. But, that might or stands a good chance right now anyways of toppling this regime. But what's going to come next? And I'm wondering if you have your own thoughts on, because what was Trotsky talking about is you had this revolution in Russia, but it brought the liberals to power. How could that be? Why, as a result of the workers rising up, did the liberals come to power? What happened? And it is a paradox. And I do think that paradox needs to be really brought to bear on the current situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, the forces of the workers' movement were much bigger and were much more organized, I should say, in Russia. But it's because the left supported the liberals. Most of the left, at least. Well, including the Bolshevik Party at first. Mm-hmm. Supported the liberals. But I don't know. I don't have particularly, absolutely smart insight. But for me, it's it could be the beginning of a long process, of many months process. I like the analogy of February. Basically, the power fell into the lap of liberals because no one else wanted to take it. And it is possible, I don't know, cracks in the regime collapses or whatever, that the liberals get it. I would note that the difference we have is that the communist movement is much weaker in Iran, or almost non-existent than it was in Tsarist Russia. Although it was underground there too, but it was much stronger. And second, I think the threat of the imperialists is, the imperialists were not going to strangle Russia right away, at least. Now the imperialists are all on the borders of Iran, waiting for that. So I think this is a second threat. However, it took some time for the working class to really lose its illusion in the liberals, and they did it in action, but it required building a pole. And the Bolshevik Party was quite small at the beginning of this whole revolutionary process, a few tens of thousands, not more than that, not even maybe, if I remember correctly. And it grew to become a mass party because of the correctness of, it could foresee the situation, and it was really staunchly against any alliance with pro-imperialist forces. That's really the lesson I think that the Iranian left must take.
Yeah. No, I mean, I would just encourage our listeners who are following what's going on in Iran to go and read how Trotsky really explains what happened during February. I think it's really, really useful. It's just, I've been thinking about it. All right, look, I want to start bringing this to what exactly we've been going on about anti-imperialism. All right. I want to bring it to, we put forward a set of demands.
Yeah.
About what communists on the ground should fight for. And of course, these might be limited, there's not exhaustive. But I want to go over them to wrap up this discussion. So we've got a subhead says a real alternative for the masses. And I want to lay out the elements of this alternative. So first, down with the Islamic Republic. I think that's pretty obvious, but I guess obvious for us, but not for the huge trend of the left.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, we insist that you need to stand with the legitimate aspirations of the masses and really oppose the huge crackdown that the regime is imposing right now on the whole country. Okay, number 2, unconditional opposition to the Shah and his agents.
Yeah, pretty basic too. There's a lot of there's some monarchists, their support are growing. And his agents, we're talking about from Mossad agents on the ground, which, obviously have to be defeated in the movement, but also liberals who are often very treacherous because they sound like they're on your side, but then they get money from the imperialists, or they look towards their ideologies. And really that has to be confronted by the left directly.
Yeah, exactly. Number 3, no surrender to the US. Unite the Middle East against imperialist Zionist tyranny.
Yeah, again, kind of important as well.
Yeah, kind of important. But again, I think the key is, and I'll just read off what we say in the statement, is there can be no freedom so long as the US and Israel dominate the region. And I think that is something that the Iranian left needs to really get and put at the center of its strategy. Like, yes, Iran's a big country, but nonetheless, it coexists within this whole dynamic, which has been, like, so long as Israel exists and so long as the US continues to have its outpost, like, there is no, like, real substantial gains and improvements for the masses of the region, including Iranians.
Yeah. We made, just on this quickly, we made a very nice and important point, I think, in an article we wrote months ago on Syria when the Assad regime failed, which, by the way, an article that, hasn't been that publicized, it said that one of the problems in the Middle East is that obviously the Middle East is dominated by the imperialists, has been carved out by the imperialists, is bombed by the imperialists, but there's always some tyrant in the way that people focus their energies of rather than the imperialists. And I think this is a really important point for the left to understand. For those who are like anything but the mullahs, it's like the whole region's been destroyed by the imperialists, and the whole goal of communists must be to unite it overall. And the basis for that unity must be against the imperialists and against those dictators or whatever who stand in the way, who disorganize the struggle against imperialism.
Yeah. 4, national liberation of Palestine, self-determination for the oppressed peoples in Iran.
We've mixed the two question actually on purpose. Palestine freedom, obviously. Well, Palestine freedom, but then the freedom for oppressed nations in Iran as well, which pro-regime people would absolutely go furious about that.
Yeah. This is actually a way to polarize the pro-Palestinian movement, actually, because like, why would you not stand for the self-determination of other oppressed nations,
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
It's just a way to unite the peoples of the Middle East. Again, you cannot unite all these various people if you do not staunchly defend the national rights in Iran, elsewhere.
Exactly. Then down with the imposition of the veil for women's liberation. Again, pretty straightforward, but honestly, like, the woman question has been a huge motor force for, upsurge in Iran for some time now. And we insist that they must be at the vanguard of the liberation struggle. But again, like, not just like on some liberal basis, but win over those fighters from the woman life freedom movement on an anti-imperialist basis.
Yeah. We haven't talked about the woman life freedom movement, unfortunately, but one of the reasons it didn't work is that it became dominated really by liberal forces. And the regime was able to tap into the anti-imperialist sentiment of the majority of the masses and really isolate it.
Yeah. Then nationalize the properties of the regime and the clergy.
Yeah, that's kind of straightforward. That's kind of the for immediate relief. You need to seize those properties. In Iran, like the security forces hold a tremendous component of the economy. There's tremendous corruption, privileges, outrages from the clergy and military, upper layer of the military. Just, seize this as a mean to rebuild the country and, mass redistribution immediately.
For sure. And then lastly, for workers' government, which I think, again, more or less straightforward. We've been talking about this throughout. And again, our detractors will say, you guys are on a different planet. It's not possible. But look at the situation and tell us what else would be a good outcome other than a workers' government. I'm sorry, but that is a hard truth and people need to hear it, honestly. So that's my conclusion to this discussion. Is there anything that you've got?
Well, there would be so much more to say, but I think we've touched on the main points, the various trends, the problem of the left, and the sort of conundrum and difficult situation we're facing.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens in the coming days. The U.S. is moving its assets into the region right now to make good on its military threats. So we'll see what happens in the next number of days, and we'll be back here with you to talk about those developments and more concerning Iran. And until then, I think we'll call it a day here. And thank you so much for taking your time to talk with me about these things. And to listeners, we love your feedback. It helps us to see what people are reacting to, what's hitting a chord, what's not. So always welcome your feedback, however critical, doesn't matter. Love it anyways. So do get in touch. I'll link our relevant articles in the show notes and I'll leave you here. Thank you and see you next time. Bye.
Thanks, Mansa. Bye.
Well, I ain't got no smoke, at least not with you. And I don't know if you capitalist, profiting massive profits, holding us down in lockstep in your